Hello, this is a videocast for St Luke's Church in Upminster in the London Borough of Havering for Sunday the 24th of May. If you haven't been here before, then my name is Josh, I'm one of the preaching team here. Welcome. Today we're going to be continuing our study in the book of Philippians, and we're in Philippians chapter 2 verses 12 to 18. And we'll just dive straight in, so if you have your Bibles, feel free to open them up to this passage. And if you don't, why don't you pause this video, go get them and read along with me. So, Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 18 say this: Therefore, my friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ, that I did not run or labour in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. You too should be glad and rejoice with me. So let's just quickly start, shall we? In verse 12, he says, Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Now, he's saying, therefore, as you have always obeyed, because in the verses previously that Chris covered last week, which if you haven't seen yet, go and watch it because it was an excellent video. Paul says in verse 8, Jesus humbled himself by being obedient to the Father, even to the point of death on a cross. He humbled himself by becoming obedient even to death on a cross. And because of that, verse 9 says, he became exalted to the highest place. And now Paul is drawing a parallel between Jesus' obedience to the Father and our obedience to Jesus. He's saying to the church in Philippi, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Well, what does he mean exactly? Well, if you think about it, Paul started this church in Philippi. We read that story in Acts chapter 16. It was Paul's first church that he started in Europe. And the normal for the church at the time would have been to be taught by Paul, to be brought to faith by Paul, to have Paul in your life all the time, praying for you and building you up and pouring his life into them. They would have worshipped with him, prayed with him, ate with him, and been taught by him. And now that he's gone, now that he had to leave to go and start other churches, he says, obey much more in my absence, but now you obey much more in my absence, and so continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. The church had to adjust to this new normal, and if you think about it, when you have something and someone so core to a church who then leaves, there comes a point where every single individual and corporately, the church had to make a decision to take their faith in their own hands and say, I will follow you, God. Even though this major part of the church is now gone, I will follow you. And Paul says, you are now obeying God even more in my absence. So continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And so they're taking hold of their own faith and going, I will work out my salvation with fear and trembling. This fear and trembling quote is from the Old Testament, and it's much more akin to awe and reverence, but in a way that is completely overwhelming. Imagine if you saw God, whose face is brighter than the sun, sat on his throne. What would you do? You probably find yourself going to your knees in absolute awe and terror at what you're seeing, and then finding that your knees aren't low enough and you have to go down onto your face just to pay him homage as to who he is. That's what it is to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, with that view of God of being so awesome, and we want and need to revere him in our lives. And this whole situation that the Philippian church is going through is much like ours. You can draw some very good parallels with what's going on with lockdown today. Just as the church in Philippi had a major part of their church, i.e. Paul, leave, we've had the major part of our church shut down for this lockdown, haven't we? And the very normal way of us doing church, i.e. going to church and having a bit of community and maybe a tea, and then we go up to we go and do worship, and then we listen to a sermon, listen to one of Michael's bad jokes, and then we worship some more, and then we go and do community afterwards. These things are all great, but now that they've gone, we find ourselves probably with a hole in our lives where we used to draw close to God in that time, and now either we're just not going to fit it and we will fall away from God slowly, or we're going to cling on to God all the more tightly during the week and say, God, I need you to fill me. I need to know your presence. I need to know your kingdom in my life. Lord, I want to obey you more and more. Please build in me something and someone that will glorify you. God, I want to obey you. And this part of church that's so good, that's been taken from us, when we rely on it to fill us, when we rely on it to get us through the week, then what happens very often is that if we go through the worship time and we think, oh, those songs were a bit slow today, I didn't really get to connect with God, or those songs were a bit quick today, I didn't really get to connect with God, or the sermon wasn't really on a topic that I was particularly interested in, I didn't really get to connect with God, then it affects the rest of our week with God. If you had this amazing prayer time or this amazing worship in church, and then the rest of the week you're on a high, and you come back to church and it feels great to get back into God's presence. Whereas if it doesn't quite go according to your taste, then it sets you up for a week that's spiritually quite dull. And what we're doing is we're relying on someone or something else to fill us, as opposed to our own relationship with God. And so in this time of lockdown, my challenge to you, church, is to not leave lockdown the same. Do not dare to leave this lockdown unchanged. We need to give more time to God in our lives so that his kingdom can come, his will can be done on earth as it is in heaven in us. And it's not by our works. We're not going to get more loving just by trying really hard. Jesus says in John chapter 15 that he says, I am the grapevine and you are the branches. The branches are the piece of a bunch of grapes. When you take off all the grapes, what you're left with is the branch, Jesus calls it. He says, you're that and I'm the grapevine. And when you abide in me and I abide in you, when you hold on to me and you look up to me and you just put your focus on me, then I will sustain you. And when you finally take your eyes off of me and look down, you will see fruit. A great branch is never going to produce fruit all by itself just by pushing really hard. It only ever produces fruit by abiding in the vine. And that's what Paul is saying the Philippian church is doing here and now. He's saying, look, you are obeying even more in my absence. You have taken on this challenge of the core part of what you thought as church leaving, and now you're growing and you're doing well. So continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And the challenge to church is continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Don't leave this lockdown unchanged, because it is God who works in you to will and act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Give him time and he will produce a good crop in you. You will see your family and your friends and those new neighbours who you probably befriended in this time. You'll start to see more opportunities to talk to them about God. They will start seeing more qualities of God in you. But one of the key fruits to working out our salvation, Paul says, in verse 14, he says, Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. For us, that's when the worship music is too slow, or when the worship music is too fast, or when the preach didn't quite talk to us. We have this opportunity when we come back, when we say, my time with God, my relationship with God doesn't depend on anyone else. It depends on me and Him. So when the worship song is too slow or when it's too fast, I'm going to stand there with arms raised high, worshipping my King, because I just want to be here to worship. I don't care what it sounds like. I don't care if anything's distracting. I just want to worship God. Or when the preach isn't on a topic that's particularly applicable, for whatever reason, I'm going to be sat there thinking, God, please show me something, or at least show me something in the Word, in the passage today that I can think on and go and chew on throughout the week. And what happens when we cling on to God, when we go and work out our salvation with fear and trembling, and when we do everything without grumbling or arguing? It's that we will become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. In the rest of verse 15, he says, then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. You will shine in the darkness when you say, my faith depends completely on me and God. And when church starts up again, I'm going to have the best time worshipping with my church family. And nothing else will be able to take from that, because I will go and worship God with my family. We're going to shine like lights in the darkness. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. He says, no one puts a cover over a lamp. That's you. You are the lamp. You don't put a cover on the lamp. You don't let anyone else try and snuff out that light because something didn't quite go as well as you wanted it to. No, you uncover it and you let it light up the whole room. That's what you will be like. We, the church, are the city on the hill that can be seen for miles around. When it's pitch black, when the world itself is full of so much darkness, we will be a piercing light. Paul says here, doesn't he? We'll be like stars in the sky as we hold firmly to the word of life. That word of life is Jesus, and it is Scripture. And as we hold firmly to Jesus and his word, you will be brighter and brighter and brighter. And then in verse 16, Paul uses this really vivid and beautiful metaphor. He says, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. This picture comes from the Old Testament, where people would sacrifice to God, and you would get a fattened lamb or calf or ox, and you would give the choice pieces to the altar, and then you would cook it, you would burn it, and the pleasing aroma would go up to God. Paul is saying that's what your faith is like. That's what your faith is. It's this pleasing aroma. It's this amazing sacrifice to God. So that when we get to the end of our lives, we won't have any excuses to say, well, this person said this to me, or the worship wasn't as good, or the preach just didn't really speak to me week after week. We will get there, and God will say to us, well done, good and faithful servant. You were truly, you knew what it was to be my child. Come and enter into your master's happiness. It's this pleasing aroma to God. Our lives are this pleasing aroma to God. And Paul on top is saying that he's being poured out like a drink offering on top of it. Now, when I think of the word poured out, I think exhausted. If I say I'm just poured out, I feel like I'm at the end of myself. But Paul here says, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. It's like Paul is the one giving his all, and it doesn't end in exhaustion. It doesn't end in exhaustion. It ends with rejoicing and gladness. And that is the upside down kingdom, is when we serve God so wholeheartedly, we will rejoice. And he says, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me. And so the challenge today, church, is are you going to leave this lockdown the same as when you entered? Or when we get to go back to church, are we going to be so much more Christ-like, so much more bright, so that when we come together we will shine like the sun or like the moon in the stars in the sky? What are we going to be like? That's my challenge. Spend more time with him and you will become brighter and brighter. Now that's it for today. Just while I'm here, make sure you tune in next week for Michael's talk on Pentecost. It's going to be about what Pentecost is for us today. How does Pentecost apply to us today? And also, while I'm at it, Kingdom Overflow, we are making a bunch of 5-minute devotional videos on a bunch of different topics. The latest one that we've just published at time of recording is Brody talking about angels. And giving us an introduction to angels in the Bible. There'll be many more to come. So they are there to build you up as a church. So feel free to watch them and let us know your thoughts. Until then, I'll see you soon.